Alright, so Epicurus' philosophy. So, like, as I was discussing, the goal here is to try to be reaching a neutral state. And it's this neutral state without the extremes, without the extremes of pleasure, which then in turn cause the extremes of pain. And it's kind of trying to find this balance and this neutral state that we kind of want to orient ourselves for. And in general, minimizing fears and worries that can also cause stress and it can also cause displeasure. And this is where we get into Epicurus' metaphysics, which I don't want to get into too much, but it also helps explain the context, and you can better understand how he wants to interact with the ethical life and why his ethics are based on this kind of first position. So, like I discussed, the overall end goal is pleasure, and therefore anything that might be working against that or working against this pleasure, and pleasure as the neutral state, is the kind of almost like sinking in kind of like water in such a way that you're not really feeling a lot of things hurting you. And so a big way of him going through this and processing it is one of the major concepts for him is reason. And it's the reason that he can deduce where he's going with his pleasure is the highest good, but it's also with reason that he sees as a kind of panacea to other kind of more existential or kind of theological threats or supernatural threats to well-being. And I'd mentioned Democritus before, and I think this will be important because I think this will be a major discussion, because you're going to want to, where would maybe higher beings play into Epicurus' thought. And so Democritus, and this is where Epicurus gets his metaphysics from, was an atomist, an ancient Greek atomist. And basically in ancient Greek atomism, there's basically two major suppositions. One, that the world is fundamentally made up of what these really small things in the Greek were called atoms. And that's what makes up the entire world. And everything that you see, all the forms you see, all the shapes and animals, they're just made up by the different patterns of coalescing and dissipating of the atoms. And this is the metaphysics, and this is the kind of materialistic metaphysics that Epicurus is working with. Just in history of ideas sense, this is quite important. I mean, this is where we get modern atomic theories from the ancient Greeks here. But it was even very influential, for example, for Sir Isaac Newton and Newtonian physics, and this kind of base idea of atoms. So you can see how they would end up becoming quite influential in Western science and Western thought. And it's actually even Karl Marx is the one who draws the specific distinction in his dissertation between Epicurus' atoms and Democritus' atomic theory. But I digress. The important point here that I want to bring out is that Epicurus was a pretty avid critic of the Hellenistic gods. You could say maybe he was being more agnostic, let's say, to a Christian god, but especially during his time, he was a vehement opponent of kind of like the Greek gods, let's say, and he was able to do this based on his metaphysics, on his idea that the world is really just these different patterns of atoms, and this is how we see and hear things, or like the moving of the atoms, and the whole world can be explained through these atoms, and we don't need supernatural deities to or like extra natural deities to be able to kind of affect that. And so for him, it really comes down to this, and he bases his metaphysics in a way off his ethics. So the only reason we need to learn about any of this stuff, we want to know how the natural world works, we want to understand things, and that's because for him, that's pleasurable. Thinking about these things is pleasurable because it minimizes these kind of existential worries. Knowing when the solstice is going to happen will be helpful if you can make sure you get your food, you make sure you get your other stuff, but just the pure knowledge of it, maybe if that's not oriented towards pleasure, it's not as important. And it's these kind of things. If you know about how this works, but you're still afraid that Persephone or Hades is going to, or Poseidon is going to throw some water at you, or Zeus is going to hit you with lightning, if you're so worried about this stuff, you're stressing and you're causing discomfort yourself, and you're therefore going against this kind of maxim of pleasure. And so I think that's another major point of Epicurus' ethics, is this kind of role of reason and using the reason to try to understand the world, because understanding the world then makes it understandable and safer and is able to better process it. And you can see in a lot of ways how Epicurus' philosophy could work for definitely some contemporary people, because it doesn't seem particularly alien to maybe like the modern way of thought in certain ways, and I think that's why I want you guys to read Epicurus, and I think he's still relevant. But of course, I also want you to be willing to maybe challenge him, because the ideas, none of these guys, for example, I mean, there's no set agreement on these ethical questions. We're all kind of searching for the idea of the good life, or the idea of ethics. And Epicurus is an important stepping point, or important stage in a potential discussion of what could be the good life here. And I think it's a much better one to contend with than, let's say, like the one I was bringing up earlier with Coroniacs, like the kind of naive hedonism, because Epicurean hedonism, this trying to reach the neutral state and trying to use reason to best understand the world, and some of those other concerns, kind of helps explain that. And there's just two more points I want to get at with Epicurus' his philosophy in this lecture, and that will be his kind of orientation to death, and as well as his kind of orientation to justice. And both of those fulfill the exact same rules before. The highest good is pleasure, so whatever is working for pleasure works. So justice only works insofar as it's maximizing the pleasure for the different people partaking in the agreement. So if justice doesn't help with that, then it's not being just anymore. And that's how Epicurus is defining justice. And the same thing with death, because he doesn't want kind of existential fears about what will happen after death. For Epicurus, well, if you're not around, then it's not a concern. And so he's using the kind of materialist metaphysics to try to explain death, because he doesn't think death is as big a problem. He thinks if you're dead, you're dead. And it definitely can be quite challenging to a lot of way people think things, and it's definitely a challenging idea, but I think it makes sense within his philosophy, and therefore I think to try to see how the different parts of his philosophy work out helps explain that. Because if he thinks we're just coalescing of atoms, then he can explain away that kind of fear. And he also thinks, I believe this is in the letter to Herodotus, so it's not one of the letters you guys read, but he also defines the soul as a mixture of atoms, and he thinks it's a material thing as well. And so some of these concerns are all just to kind of explain something centered around his particular form of hedonism. And the last point I kind of want to make about his hedonism is it's oriented to the individual. It's oriented to what the particular kind of biological organism that is us, how we can most feel pleasure. And that's kind of how his ethics is. So the ethical behavior is something that will bring about a neutral state for us as individuals. And that definitely that might get your goat a little bit. I can see that conflicting with people, and I think that would be good, because I think it really conflicts with both the way monks, Mencius, and the way Aristotle see ethics. Because for both of them, especially because Aristotle, think about it, it's eudaimonia for the political entity, the community, and it's how the individual fits within the community. And for Mencius, it's a similar thing. It's about how we the gentleman, as the gentleman fits in the family, and as he fits in the way of the state, and how everyone also works then as a greater whole, like a kind of communal whole. And I think both of their orientation towards the larger social whole, as that leads to the individual, is very different from Epicurus, who begins with just the individual. And I think this kind of distinction, these kind of ways of seeing it, this hedonism, this individualistic hedonism versus the kind of communal orientation towards the better life, offer two different ways of kind of approaching this ethical question that we can try to wrestle with here. And so hopefully this kind of explains some of the basic ideas of Epicurus, and that's kind of what I wanted to get at with this